Karen called 911 on my kids for trespassing, but we actually own the land. The Johnson family had always dreamed of owning a lakefront property. When they finally found the perfect home, they were over the moon. The house sat gracefully on the edge of a shimmering blue lake, surrounded by tall, lush pine trees and gently sloping hills. It was the ideal setting for creating memories, peaceful mornings watching the sunrise over the water, afternoons spent fishing, and evenings with the sound of laughter during family barbecues. The kids couldn't wait to jump into the lake and make the most of their new backyard. As they settled in, the neighborhood seemed perfect. Neighbors were warm and welcoming, offering homemade cookies and friendly smiles. Everyone waved from their driveways as the family unloaded boxes and explored the area. But not everyone was as friendly. On the second day, as the Johnsons were getting their yard in order, they noticed a woman standing by the edge of the property. She had big blonde hair and wore a bright red blazer. An odd choice for a casual lakeside afternoon. She was holding a clipboard, peering out at the water as if she owned the entire lake. When the family approached, she introduced herself as Karen, the head of the local Lake Preservation Committee. With a stern tone, she handed over a typed set of lake rules, insisting that the children stay off the shoreline. Her presence was commanding, and as she walked away, the Johnsons couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much larger. They had no idea yet how deeply Karen's influence would affect their lives. The following day, the Johnsons were still processing their strange encounter with Karen. But they brushed it off, assuming it was an isolated incident. They didn't expect it to escalate so quickly. That afternoon, the kids begged to go down to the lake's edge. Their excitement was palpable, as they skipped stones and waded into the shallows, laughing as they splashed water at each other. Everything seemed perfect until the sound of heavy footsteps interrupted their fun. Karen was marching down the slope, clipboard in hand, a stern expression on her face. She stood at the edge of the water, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, eyes locked onto the children. "This is private property," she snapped, pointing a finger at the lake. "You have no right to be here." The Johnsons were taken aback. Their kids, startled and confused, looked up at them for guidance. The Johnsons' hearts sank as Karen continued, her voice rising with each word. "This entire lakefront is mine. And I will not allow trespassing, especially by minors. You're breaking the rules." Trying to stay calm, the Johnsons explained that they owned the shoreline as per their deed, which they had confirmed when they bought the property. But Karen was unshaken. She insisted that the entire lakefront was her family's legacy and even claimed that her documents proved it. The Johnsons, stunned, asked to see the papers. But Karen waved them off, dismissing their concerns with vague accusations about damaging the ecosystem. When they suggested they discuss the matter with the HOA or some official body, Karen proudly declared that she wasn't just a member, she was practically in charge of the whole lake. Her threats didn't stop there. As the family tried to get their kids inside to avoid further confrontation, Karen left them with a chilling warning: "If you don't comply, I'll take legal action." The Johnsons stood there in shock, their peaceful lakefront now tainted by a woman who seemed to believe she had the power to control not just the shoreline, but their entire lives. The days following Karen's warning felt like a tense waiting game. The Johnsons tried their best to ignore her, hoping it was just a fleeting episode of overzealous behavior. But they couldn't have been more wrong. As the weekend approached, the sun was high, And the weather perfect, a perfect afternoon for the kids to finally enjoy the lake. They excitedly ran outside, eager to dip their toes in the water once again. The air was filled with their laughter as they played along the shoreline, completely unaware of the storm that was brewing. Within minutes, the family heard the unmistakable sound of someone approaching. It was Karen, her heels crunching against the gravel as she stormed down the slope toward them. This time, her expression was even more severe. She was holding her phone, visibly dialing something as she walked. The kids froze, sensing the tension in the air. Without warning, Karen pointed at them and shouted, "You're trespassing on my property again. Get away from the water." Now, before the Johnsons could even respond, Karen was speaking loudly into her phone. "Making a scene? Yes. 911. I have trespassers on my property. They refuse to leave. And they're damaging the lake." Her voice was frantic. But there was no mistaking the absurdity of her accusations. The police arrived just minutes later. The officer, looking puzzled, stepped out of the patrol car and surveyed the calm, sunny scene. The kids were playing happily, not even near the water's edge. And no one was causing any trouble. The officer raised an eyebrow, as Karen quickly ran over to explain her version of events. "They're on my land. They don't belong here," she insisted, pointing at the Johnsons. Remaining calm, the officer turned to the Johnsons and asked to see their property deed. They showed him immediately, clearly marked with the boundaries that included the shoreline. The officer took a moment to read over the document before nodding, confirming that the lakefront was indeed theirs. He turned to Karen, who was still trying to argue, and asked her for proof of her claims. Karen, flustered and desperate, fumbled with her clipboard, pulling out a stack of papers that looked official but lacked any legal seals or signatures. The officer's patience was wearing thin. "Ma'am," he said sternly, "this appears to be their property. You cannot just claim ownership without any documentation. This is a civil matter, not something for 911. Karen's face flushed with rage, but she still refused to back down. She muttered about historical rights and control over the land. But the officer simply turned and walked away. "If you believe you have a claim, take it to court. But harassing these people with false calls won't get you anywhere." As the police car drove away, Karen stood there, seething with anger. The Johnsons, though relieved, couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't done yet. This confrontation was far from over, and they knew things were about to escalate even further. But for the first time, they felt empowered. This battle wasn't over. But they weren't backing down either. With the police call behind them, the Johnsons knew they couldn't let Karen's threats slide any longer. They realized that if they were going to protect their home and their children from her aggressive tactics, they needed to be prepared. No longer willing to simply react to Karen's behavior, they decided to take matters into their own hands. They started by gathering every note and letter Karen had left them, each one more absurd than the last. They collected Karen's so-called lake preservation rules, her ridiculous violation notices, and any threatening messages she had sent, all of which seemed to be full of legal jargon, but lacked any real basis. The Johnsons weren't alone in their frustrations. As they began asking around, they learned that Karen's overbearing behavior wasn't limited to them. A few neighbors, hesitant at first, shared their own stories of Karen's harassment. One family recounted how Karen, had once called the police on them for having a birthday party by the lake, claiming they were disturbing wildlife. Another neighbor said that Karen had threatened to fine him for having a canoe rack on his own property because it obstructed her view. The more the Johnsons heard, the more it became clear that Karen wasn't just a quirky neighbor, she was a bully who thrived on intimidation. Determined to get to the bottom of Karen's false claims, the Johnsons reached out to the HOA to confirm her supposed role in the community. They were stunned to find out that Karen wasn't on the HOA board at all. In fact, she wasn't even part of any official committee. She had simply attended a few meetings, inserted herself into conversations, and demanded things be done her way. The HOA president confirmed that Karen had no authority over the lake or the neighborhood. It was all just smoke and mirrors. Karen had built a reputation by making others believe she had power when, in fact, she didn't. Armed with this new knowledge, the Johnsons felt a renewed sense of determination. They were no longer just dealing with a disgruntled neighbor, they were up against a woman who had manipulated her way into a position of power that didn't exist. With evidence in hand and the truth on their side, the Johnsons knew they were ready for the next step. It was time to confront Karen head-on, and put an end to her reign of intimidation once and for all. The day of the HOA meeting finally arrived, and the Johnsons felt a mix of anticipation and nervousness. They knew that this was their chance to end Karen's reign of terror. But it wouldn't be easy. The community center was buzzing with chatter as neighbors trickled in, many of whom had never attended an HOA meeting before. Word had spread about the Johnsons' ongoing battle with Karen, and everyone was curious to see what would happen. The room filled quickly, and the board members took their seats at the long table, flipping through official documents. The Johnsons sat near the front, a folder of evidence in hand, prepared to finally expose Karen for what she truly was. When the meeting began, Sarah, a well-spoken member of the HOA board, introduced the Johnsons and explained that they had concerns about lake access and property rights. Karen, as expected, strutted into the room, her binder clutched tightly to her chest. She was all too aware of the attention she was about to receive. But she remained confident, after all. She believed she still had the upper hand. As she walked past the rows of neighbors, she shot glares at anyone who dared make eye contact, her posture rigid and defensive. The moment Sarah turned the floor over to the Johnsons, the room fell silent. With a calm, steady voice, Mr. Johnson stood up and introduced himself, laying out the facts. He explained how Karen had repeatedly harassed his family, issuing baseless threats and intimidation tactics. He showed the property deed that clearly marked the lakefront as part of their property and pointed to the HOA bylaws, which did not support Karen's claims in any way. The room listened intently as he described how Karen had called 911 on their children for trespassing and how her false violation notices had caused unnecessary stress. One by one, neighbors started nodding in agreement. Several shared their own experiences with Karen. One man stood up, recounting how Karen had once tried to arrest his grandchildren for playing near the water. Another woman spoke up, describing how Karen had fined her for putting a small canoe in the lake, despite it being perfectly legal. The room began to stir as more and more neighbors voiced their frustration, with some even sharing their own stories of being intimidated by Karen. Karen, unable to contain her anger, jumped to her feet, waving her binder in a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. She claimed, once again, that her family owned the lake and had historical records to prove it. Sarah, the HOA spokesperson, calmly asked to see these records. But Karen refused, muttering that they were too valuable to present. Her desperation was obvious, and the crowd was growing increasingly skeptical. Finally, the board members asked Karen if she had any actual documentation to support her claims. She faltered, offering nothing but vague assertions about her family's supposed historical ownership. The board members exchanged looks, and Sarah, with a quiet but firm voice, made it clear, the lake is recognized as shared property among several owners, with a small portion managed by a conservancy group. Karen? You have no official standing here. The room erupted in applause, the community finally rallying together against the bully who had once held so much power over them. Karen, now humiliated and exposed, stood there, her face flushed with rage. She tried to argue, but her words were drowned out by the cheers of the community. The HOA board officially adopted a new policy, confirming that all residents and their guests were allowed to enjoy the lake within their property lines. And Karen's so-called Lake Preservation Committee was dismissed once and for all. As the meeting came to an end, the Johnsons felt a sense of relief wash over them. The fight wasn't over, but they had just won a major victory. Karen was no longer in control, and the lake, once tainted by her false claims, was now a shared space for everyone to enjoy. The Johnsons had stood up to the bully, and the community was stronger for it. It was a moment of triumph, not just for the Johnsons, but for everyone who had suffered under Karen's manipulative tactics. After the HOA meeting, Karen's behavior spiraled into a frenzy. She was no longer the confident, self-assured woman who once commanded attention in the neighborhood. Her every attempt to exert control over the lakefront was met with resistance. And the community, emboldened by the board's official stance, no longer cowered in fear. The next few days were filled with tension. Karen continued to post strange notices along the shoreline, claiming ownership of her lake. But no one took them seriously anymore. Her once commanding presence had turned into a sad spectacle. Karen's attempts to enforce her fake rules grew more desperate. She put up large, unsightly signs declaring the lake to be private property, blocking the view of the water for everyone. But instead of intimidating the neighbors, it only fueled their frustration. The Johnsons, relieved but wary, continued to enjoy the lake, determined to reclaim the peace that had been stolen from them. But the weight of Karen's presence still lingered in the air, and they knew it wouldn't be long before she tried something else. Then, one afternoon, a neighbor stopped by with a piece of information that would change everything. The neighbor had heard rumors that Karen was renting the house she lived in, not owning it as she had claimed. Curious, the Johnsons dug deeper and, to their shock, discovered that Karen's name was not listed as the owner of the property. Instead, it was owned by a property management company. It turned out that Karen had been using the house to bully the neighbors, pretending to have ownership of the entire lake, when in reality, she had no legal claim to anything at all. The Johnsons were stunned, but the revelation only made things clearer. Karen had been faking her authority all along. The landlord, frustrated by the negative attention Karen had caused, had begun receiving complaints from both the neighbors and the HOA. Videos of her aggressive behavior, especially the time she had called 911 on innocent children, had gone viral, making her a laughingstock. The landlord, now fully aware of the chaos Karen had caused, had had enough. He issued her an eviction notice. Karen, who had once bullied the neighborhood into submission, was now facing the consequences of her actions. As she packed up her belongings, the neighbors couldn't help but watch in satisfaction. Some whispered in disbelief, while others cheered quietly from their windows. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Karen, who had spent so much time trying to control everyone else's lives, was now the one being forced out. The moving van came and went, and with it, Karen's tyrannical grip on the neighborhood was finally gone. With Karen gone, the neighborhood was transformed. The lake, once a source of tension and fear, was now a place of joy again. The Johnsons watched their kids run freely to the water, laughing as they splashed and played without worry. Families gathered along the shore, enjoying the peaceful setting that had been overshadowed by Karen's control for far too long. The HOA, now free from Karen's disruptive influence, turned its attention to maintaining the community and organizing fun events. The once quiet, tense neighborhood had become a thriving, friendly community once more. For the Johnsons, the relief was palpable. The dream they had envisioned when they first moved in, spending carefree afternoons by the lake with their children, was finally a reality. As the sun set over the shimmering water, they couldn't help but smile. The lake, once a battleground, was now the shared sanctuary they had always imagined it to be. And with Karen's departure, the neighborhood had not only found peace but had also rediscovered its sense of unity. The Johnsons, along with their neighbors, knew that they had triumphed over adversity, and, most importantly, they had done it together. As the Johnsons finally enjoyed the peaceful lake they had always dreamed of, the neighborhood was united, free from the shadow of Karen's false authority. It's a powerful reminder that standing up to intimidation can bring about real change. And when a community comes together, anything is possible. But what do you think? Have you ever faced someone like Karen? Or perhaps you've witnessed a similar situation where standing your ground made all the difference. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let us know what you think of the Johnsons' story and how they stood up to the bully in their neighborhood. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notifications so you never miss out on new content. Your support helps us continue bringing you amazing stories that keep you engaged and inspired. Thanks for watching, and we can't wait to share the next chapter with you.